What's that noise? Good morning. How are you guys? Good. Good morning. How are you? Good. Hey, let me, since we have a minute before class starts, let me just draw your attention to the questions up on the board and have you think a little bit about those before we get started today. Good morning. Good morning. I don't know what that weird noise is, but it's just going to happen. Why don't we go ahead and, and get started? Hey, Carly, how are you? I want you to take just a moment to stop chatting with your neighbor and just give a thought to the quotes up here on the board from your reading. Any quick thoughts before we get started here on any sort of thoughts on the readings today? What struck you? Yeah, go ahead.
I like in the Leopold reading, the emphasis you put on the philosophical value of the land that really economic.
Right. So if you guys didn't hear Luke, he enjoyed the emphasis on sort of philosophical as opposed to strictly economic value of land. Other things that sort of struck you in readings? Anyone? Things that stood out? Yeah, go ahead, Larissa.
Talking about how like nothing's getting done, and it's a little bit depressing to feel like, oh yeah, we're still at that point more than years later. And he's already talking about how the conservation movement started like half a century earlier or whatever. And so it's interesting how his philosophy seems like very it seems very reasonable actually, the idea that you have some respect for the land. That we use it in the best way possible to respect for the environment, but it's something that apparently is still unattainable.
Yeah, I think for anyone who studies history, one is often struck by how things that you think are current are actually strong themes without a movement or history. Yeah, Emma.
Different like ways to define like morals and the whole like idea of moral beings, and especially the whole like pain and the capacity for suffering and like pain and evil is just like wildly frustrating to me, because like yes, like pain is bad and unpleasant and stuff, but also like sometimes like necessary for growth. And it's like really interesting to see sort of like the tangentially environmental movements that like sometimes goals align, but then also sometimes it doesn't, like a whole like a predator would be evil for like killing a deer or something like that. And it was just, I don't know, it is interesting to sort of like read about like the sort of different moral angles that different movements come at.
Right, and I assume most people here and most people in the United States would, regardless of where they fall in their agreement or disagreement with you, probably consider themselves moral people. But I hope as you did that reading, you recognized one of the themes of the course is people can come to the same decision about what might be done in a current situation from very, very different moral perspectives. And even within, part of the reason to focus on this today is to understand that people come at their desire to preserve or not preserve, protect or not protect the environment and human relationships with each other based on, quite different perspectives on morality. And it's important to understand where you're coming from as an individual, because I think a lot of times these are really implicit ideas. We operate with this implicit notion of what morality means to us. And I think it's very important, especially if you're trying to get to some sort of yes in some situation, some sort of decision that people can agree on, to really understand the very different places that people might come from. So what I'm hoping we can do today is to spend a little bit of time looking at some different scenarios, kind of mini case studies of like just situations, and try to imagine the world, again, occupying these different perspectives, putting ourselves into these different sort of moral frameworks for understanding human relationships. Because I think it's very helpful to sort of, especially when you're encountering people who are coming from a really different moral perspective, to kind of understand where they're coming from with their own moral system. And certainly not to, I think it'll probably be pretty obvious that I align myself with certain moral worldviews, but I don't think that moral alignment on my part makes my moral perspectives any more valid than anyone else's. It just happens to be where I'm coming from. And I think it's important for me to really understand, that there's perfectly legitimate alternate moral perspectives that people come from, and respect their perspectives and understand the commonalities in terms of where we might want to go, even coming at it with these really different moral perspectives. I don't see it as my job in life to convince people to share my moral perspective. I think it is my job in life at some point to try to convince people, or not convince people, but to find ways where we can align to move towards things that we can agree on together that would make the world a better place. So anyways, good thinking on that. We'll return to all these. A couple of details to address before we go on. As you guys know, you have a quiz this weekend. It's posted who you're taking it with. I put up a practice quiz. The quiz itself should definitely be up by Saturday morning, as usual, probably before then. Any questions on the quiz? It's the same deal. Group 7 people, email me and let's talk. Any broader questions on the quiz at all? A lot of folks seem to be making good progress on their several folks. So I'm now talking about the community-based projects, the community voices interviews. I think several of you have completed your interviews, have it transcribed, and that's really cool. The assignment is due next week, so you really do want to, hopefully you all have your interviews scheduled. Some of you are not being so good about checking off where you are in the process on that form. Either that or you're pretty far behind. Either way, you really do want to be checking your progress off on that progress form so that Maddie and I can know where you are and help you out if you're not where you need to be. And please do feel free to reach out to us. A couple of you have said, hey, I'm having trouble scheduling things. And, we've given you some suggestions on how to interact with people. And in some cases, just switch people you're interviewing. We still do have a couple wonderful people who agreed to be interviewed who aren't yet doing it. So if you are having real problems coordinating or finding or getting responses from the person you chose to interview, there are alternate options and you should work on them immediately. Whenever you're working with other people, you really need to think about their schedule and what's going to work for them. It's very difficult to do things at the last minute. So you really want to get this set up as soon as possible. That's why we're asking you to set up those interviews actually a week ago so that you were all set up, because sometimes there's logistics, sometimes for whatever reason an interview doesn't happen when it's supposed to happen, and you want to give yourself a little bit of slack on that one. But yeah, like I say, a bunch of you are already done, and kudos to you. Any questions on that assignment? Yes. Yes, I could see that maybe you were not aware of that because you don't have much checked on that. So let me just show you exactly what I'm talking about here. Yeah, so if you click, there's a link within the assignment doc in that set of links that takes you to this spreadsheet. And it has sort of the major project milestones in it. And you want to put a Y next to your name so that Maddie and I can track like where you are in this process. Lots of you guys are on this document. Everyone has checked at least one box, so I assumed you guys knew where it was. But yep. All right, any other questions on this? Good, so soon we will be setting you up, after this set of interviews, we'll be setting you up with your community partner interviews, which is reminding me that I really got to get my act together and round up my community partners for that. Okay, one more important detail as far as next week's classes go. Part of my objective, as I've said in this class before, is to expose you to a lot of different perspectives on the environment. And I'm fortunate to be blessed with a set of colleagues in environmental studies who really do approach environmental issues from very different perspectives. And so part of what I try to do in this course is make sure I invite in all my colleagues to talk with you over the course of the semester so that you get a chance to see these different perspectives and also to get a sense of the research areas of interest of my colleagues, so that those of you who are thinking about taking more environmental studies courses, get an idea of what we're up to and who you might want to work with. Swapna Pathak obviously gave a wonderful lecture the other day. Next week, we have two guests, Chia Sakakibara and Janet Fischio, who focus on environmental studies very much from a humanities perspective, which is part of the reason I want to kind of set this up with some basic discussion of ethics and justice issues, because that's a lens that they use more than I do in thinking about human relationships with each other and with the natural world. Very, very interesting people. Janet Fischio, variety of interests, but she's interested in sustainable agriculture and climate change from a humanities perspective, so more from a literature perspective, very interested in issues of environmental justice. Chia Sakakibara focuses on how indigenous peoples, especially Nupiat people, address and are resilient in the face of climate change. So both of these talks are going to be very interesting. Problem is they teach at the same time I do. They're teaching right now. So the only way I could have them in as guest lecturers is by shifting the times. If you look at the schedule next week, our two classes are evening classes next week, 7 p.m. Now, some of you are going to say, oh, I've got some conflict. We will record those. I really want you to be there because, you know, I've asked them to make these as interactive as they possibly can be. They will both be on Zoom, but, you know, I will record them. So if you have conflicts, you know, let me know if you have a conflict, but if you have conflicts, they'll be recorded so you can watch them. But I want you to be there because they'll be interactive and so, yeah. So, but do sort of notice that next week they're both evening classes because that's the only way I could have them participate since they're teaching at this particular time. Any questions on anything I've said so far? I think you're really going to enjoy them next week. Well, so one of the things that we sort of haven't quite squeezed in when we were talking about sustainability is resilience. I want to talk a little bit about resilience before I talk about ethical systems. And I want to just say these things do actually converge. Chia Sakakibara, for instance, is very interested in cultural resilience. How are Native peoples being culturally resilient in the face of, you know, who are very nature-based in their worldview and in their livelihoods? How are they adjusting and trying to maintain their culture in the face of you know, ecological changes, which are particularly dramatic in the polar regions that she studies. So just want to say it's actually connected, the issue of resilience and ethics. But okay, so I'm going to go back a few classes and just point out we use this often when we talk about resilience. We use this idea of balls in this sort of two-dimensional landscape and how stable they are, how easy it is to knock them out, as ways of kind of understanding the sort of background of what it means to be resilient. So we think of the balls and how easy it is to knock them, how much they want to return to where they are in their particular, you know, framework here as being indications of how resilient a system is. And from a sort of environmental studies perspective, we're interested in resilience in all of the dimensions of, so all three of the dimensions of sustainability, you know, the ecological dimension, the social dimension, and the economic dimension. So when we talked about this idea about sustainability and resilience both being sort of like dominant frameworks for thinking about, you know, environmental change and environmental stability, but also kind of contrasting. They're complementary, but also sort of contrasting in their emphasis and what they're thinking about. So I gave you some definitions of stability, generally the ability to resist change, but these different kinds of stability, resisting change in an inertial sense is it's hard to make something change. You know, it resists change from the outset, as opposed to resilient stability, which is the ability of something to come back once it's been changed. So a hurricane comes through, knocks down all the buildings, but people rebuild really quickly. So that's an example of resilient stability, as opposed to inertial stability. People have built structures that are really resistant to the hurricane coming through, and they stay there in spite of the hurricane coming through. So just different kinds of resiliency. And it's important to understand those different kinds of resiliency. And as we try to build robust systems that are good systems and are going to last, I think increasingly we need to think about building systems that exhibit both inertial stability, so they resist good things that resist change, and they exhibit resilient stability, they come back. I do want to say something at the outset if talking about resilience, which I think people often confuse. Resilience is a term that describes systems. It is not a value statement. Like when we use the word sustainability, we generally think of sustainability as being something that's inherently desirable. We want to create a sustainable world that values ecological, social, and economic dimensions and finds a convergence of those in which it's a just society that can, be ecologically perpetuated into the future. A resilient system, resilience doesn't mean good or bad in any way, shape, or form. So it's different from sustainability in that way. You can have a very bad system that is very resilient. You can have a system that is very unjust. You could create a fascist system. There are a lot of dictators out there in the world who have been extraordinarily resilient in sticking in power and maintaining themselves in the face of lots of attempts to change the system into a different system. So you can have an extraordinarily unjust system that is resilient. So the property of being resilient is only good or bad with respect to whether the system is good or bad. So it's just kind of important to understand that. And I think that actually gets confused quite a bit in the literature as well, when people talk about resilience as necessarily a good thing. There are lots of resilient systems out there that I would love to see overthrown with some other system because they're bad systems. So just keep that in mind. Resilience is not good or bad. The original concept of resilience was developed for ecological systems, but it's been adapted to think much more about systems that incorporate, again, all three dimensions of the sustainability concept. So in a general sense, again, this is from your reading for a couple classes back, it's the capacity of the system to absorb disturbance, reorganize to retain essential features, and the same functional structure and feedbacks. So, and people often use this term identity. I think this is an important term to use because whether you see a system as resilient really depends on the characteristic of the identity you're looking at. So when I think about our future, I think there are certain desirable things about our culture. And it's those particular desirable things about our culture, and they're not consistent across the board, but, a drive towards equity, belief in egalitarianism, valuing diversity. Those are sort of attributes that I find good attributes that are certainly themes within our culture, even if there are aspects of our culture that does not value those things. So I might think about those particular things as the things I would like to be resilient, because to me, they're part of the better identity of who we are as a culture, right? So you can look at different aspects of the system is my point. But to be resilient is to maintain that identity. So a lot of other aspects of the system could change. For instance, the aspects I just mentioned, I think are in some ways, they're certainly not supported by the degree to which our society is a consumer society. So I'd like to see us basically eliminate the sort of focus on consumption, which is so fundamental to our society, the sort of almost singular focus on consumption as, the measure of at least economic goodness in our society. Overthrow that piece of the system, but keep a lot of the other parts. So be resilient with respect to one aspect of the system or one set of characteristics of the system, but actually not resilient. Again, I'm using the word overthrow because that's actually used within the literature to describe these patterns of change within systems as they move from one stable state to hopefully a different stable state. So yeah, again, we tend to be today when we talk about resilience, at least in a theoretical way, thinking about that full scope of systems, and we tend to call it a coupled social ecological system. So you see that term thrown around a lot, coupled social ecological systems, understanding their dependence on each other. We're basically asking the question, when you subject the system, the integrated social ecological system, to some sort of a disturbance, how does it respond? That's sort of, that's how we assess resilience. How does it respond to that? And the reading that you did talked about some basic principles of systems that relate to resilience. So this idea of social ecological systems as being self-organizing. That is, the systems themselves have various components that interact, the social and the ecological dimensions interact in ways that allow them to sort of self-organize over time, not completely controlled by, sort of a top-down type approach. They evolve, they develop over time. They have the capacity for self-organization, but that capacity is limited. There are thresholds, so they can adjust to changes, major changes like climate change, over certain realms, for instance, certain ranges of temperature, and you go beyond that, some thresholds, and they have to change. They can't retain their basic identity beyond certain thresholds. And again, those thresholds could be biophysical, like temperature. They could be economic. They could be social, for instance. And you can apply this lens to almost anything. You could look at the issues of racial injustice, the attention on racial injustice, Black Lives Matter movement, and one might hope that we have a historical, for lack of a better term, I'll say Jim Crow set of biases that pervade our society. And some people might argue the Black Lives Matter represents kind of, or the George Floyd situation. We might actually be in a situation where we've achieved some threshold in which people are no longer willing to tolerate. This was a hopeful look at this. And so what we're seeing now is some sort of a shift to some other situation, which could be much better. It could, in fact, be much worse, where we've had out of this system. But I'm just using that as an example of, I think a lot of people are looking at what's taking place now as kind of a threshold event. We've reached some state of the system where the current system is not tolerable, and it's going to change. And it's unclear exactly how it's going to change, but it's going to change because some threshold has been reached. Again, I'm just trying to use examples from different contexts. But there's also this notion in resilience of systems exhibiting regular cycles. So systems are never in stasis. And this is kind of where the concepts of resilience do kind of butt up against a little bit against the concept of sustainability. Again, it's not a total contradiction, but there's more of a recognition in resilience theory that systems are always in some sort of mode of change. They're always involved in some sort of change. They exhibit these cycles of change over time. And again, initially applied to ecological systems, but increasingly applied to social and economic systems. And that the systems and cycles occur at multiple scales. So you can see change occurring at small scales, and then playing up to larger and larger scales, again, sort of fitting into that notion of hierarchy we talked about at the beginning of this class. And this is an important thing. When we talk about thresholds, what we're talking about is points at which, and thinking back to that ball in the landscape, that ball actually moves to another stable state. That's a situation where it has transformed from one basic state to a different basic state, whereas adaptation is sort of more gradual change to the pressures acting on the system. And then, another concept is that that maintaining and building resilience actually has some costs. So when you're thinking about a system, and I guess I'll use a biophysical analogy for this. The fires out west. So there are a number of different reasons why we're having these extreme fires. And certainly one of the reasons is climate change. We have a different climate that's drier and drying things out. But it also has to do with how we've managed the forests. And we have suppressed, we've known this for many, many decades. We've suppressed forest fires. We've allowed people to build houses in areas that are prone to forest fires, and that's caused us to suppress more forest fires. The native peoples who lived out west used to regularly burn the landscape that actually maintained more biodiversity and sort of lowered the intensity of fires because they were smaller scale fires that used up a lot of the fuel that is fueling these massive fires that are taking place because we've suppressed fire. But that's an example of we maintained short-term stability suppressing fires, we actually made the system much more vulnerable to long-term. So there's a cost of having had shorter-term resilience in those systems in terms of its longer-term resilience to those things. Again, that's an example of these sort of multiple factors: climate change and management interacting in ways that are affecting the resilience of the system. Anyway, these are all just sort of like concepts that you want to understand as you think about change in systems. I don't want to spend a whole lot more time on this because I want to talk about ethics, but this idea of self-organization, we've talked about earlier in the course when we talked about just systems and the idea of the parts interacting with each other. It's all about feedback, self-organization, feedback between the individual components, leading to properties where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But the idea that you can maintain identity while replacing the parts, that's a characteristic of a resilient system. An analogy I often use for that in Oberlin, which is not actually terribly relevant this year, is the Oberlin Student Cooperative Association, which most of you haven't experienced as first years. But the different co-ops at Oberlin have their own personality. Every year they replace their membership. Sure, some people come back, but over the course of 4 years, it's completely new membership, and yet they retain their identity. They're resilient systems, they're sort of self-reinforcing systems in the sense that they can retain their identity in spite of the fact that every component of that system, at least in terms of their membership, is changing over time. So they're resilient in that sense. The parts are changing, the whole is retaining its identity. Same is obviously true of Oberlin College at some level. I've been here a long time now, and you folks come in and every year the seniors graduate and say, I'm really worried the incoming class is like way more conservative than we were. They're not what we were. And I'm like, yeah, you have no idea. They're the same as you guys, and it'll be the same system 20 years from now that it is now, hopefully. It's not really going to change. All right, so self-organization, capacity for self-organization is limited by these thresholds. Again, this is one of the big concerns in climate changes. Thresholds of temperature change beyond with the system, it just positive feedbacks kick in, and the system just goes to a whole new place, and it may be a whole new place that is not particularly compatible with human habitation or habitation by other organisms we care about. So there's all kinds of other terms in here. Again, I don't know that you need to really get deep into these, but the concept of hysteresis, that when you change a system, you oftentimes cannot go back to what was there before. When you hit a threshold and the system changes, it's oftentimes impossible to go backwards. You can only go in one direction. I was listening to a lecture last night, actually by a colleague named David Orr. He's very good at analogies. He's very good at many things. But he was talking about sort of our future options as like off-ramps on a highway. And that, he was trying to offer a little bit of optimism about what might happen in worst case scenario with this election. But with climate change in general, we have a variety of off-ramps we can take, off-ramps that involve actually solving our problems. If we miss this off-ramp, we can't go back to that place. There may be another off-ramp in the future that might take us to a better place than not taking that off-ramp. But once we miss an opportunity, it is a missed opportunity. There always may be options for doing something better in the future, but you can't go backwards in this world. Time moves in one direction. It's got a one-way arrow, and a lot of choices have one-way arrows. You make them, and then you cannot go back and remake that choice. So anyways, these are examples in this analogy of where the thresholds are and where the sort of what we might call regimes are, places where there's stability in this thing. So you cross one of those hills, and it's very hard to get back over that hill again. Once you've crossed that hill, you're in a new terrain, and it would take a lot of work to get you back into the old state that you were in before. And I really don't want to go into this, but if you get into the literature of resilience, they often use this sort of like, 8 as a sort of like way of thinking about these adaptive cycles and, patterns of change in systems that occur over time, and sort of places that one might occupy in this adaptive cycle, places where things are stable for long periods of time, places where you've hit thresholds and the system is changing fairly rapidly. And it's a very useful model for thinking about your engagement with any particular movement, for instance, in the world. Where is that movement? Are we near some sort of a threshold? If you're unhappy with the current system, what is it that you can do to push the system beyond that threshold to get it into another state where it's more desirable? What are the risks of pushing it into another state when you don't know for sure what state it might go into? These are all things you should be thinking about as you think about yourself as a change agent in the world. Is where are you trying to push the system? I don't know what that noise is. Okay, so again, I'm not really going to go into that, but it has these different phases here. And right. And again, those cycles occur at multiple scales. Just as one example, an ecological example that I experienced very much in my own life. I grew up in my youth. I spent much of my time on an embayment in Massachusetts, on Cape Cod, called Wacoit Bay. And for most of my youth, that bay was dominated by one particular kind of plant, aquatic plant called eelgrass. And that eelgrass harbored a whole ecosystem that, among other things, had bay scallops in it. And so it was a system dominated by these bay scallops. Well, in this particular situation, the tipping point had to do with nutrients from all of our septic systems lining the bay, which released nutrients in there, which caused the growth of algae in the water, which shaded out the eelgrass and fundamentally changed it from one system to another system. So for the first, so you can see little stuff grow. That's an eelgrass blade there on the right. And you can see all the little stuff growing on it. That stuff is growing on it because of all the nutrients, shading out the eelgrass and transforming it into a different kind of system, which it has been. So it passed one of these thresholds. And since that period of time, about 20 years ago now, maybe 25 years ago, it has just been a different ecosystem. It's not the same ecosystem. And there have been some efforts to put it back, but really, it's just a different system now. It's not going to be the same. It's a different system. And I think we're seeing that with many, many ecosystems around the world with climate change. They cross a threshold and they become a different system. And you just have to deal with that reality. Maybe you can make something good happen with a new system, but it is not going back to the old system. It's different. It is stable now, but it's a different system and it's stable in a different way. It crossed that threshold. Anyway, I won't go into more of the theory to that. It doesn't go back, but anyway. All right, I'm going to skip over this because I really want to talk about ethics. So, like I say, what I'm hoping you're actually going to be able to do, especially next week once Tia comes in and gives her lecture, is begin to draw these connections between concepts of resilience that we might principally think about as being more in the biophysical domain, to thinking about them very much in a cultural domain. What do all those ideas I just shared with you and you read about mean when you start to think about indigenous cultures and how they can maintain their identity in the face of a world around them that is changing? What does that mean for them to maintain that identity in the face of that? All right, so I want to do some real basics on ethics here. So ethics, according to the dictionary, it's just a system of moral principles, right? So it's a system of thinking about the world based on principles. And what we want to do today is just sort of explore those different principles. It can also be defined as a branch of philosophy dealing with values related to human conduct with respect to the rightness and wrongness of certain actions and to the goodness or badness of the motives of such actions. So oftentimes when we're thinking about other people or we're thinking about ourselves, we're thinking about how do I feel as though my actions right now are good or bad? What criteria am I using to sort of assess the goodness or badness of my actions? When I look at other people who are engaging in the world, are they good actors or bad actors? What's motivating their action? And I think it's very useful in thinking, especially about our current, very divided political situation, to really try to understand the ethical basis of people who are coming at this world from very different viewpoints. I think Cindy France did an excellent job of helping us to understand the sort of core social motives that people come from. Those core social motives are oftentimes very associated with ethical standpoints that people have as well. So think about them as sort of like a parallel to the core social motives, these sort of differing moral principles that people are operating with. And so ethicists have this sort of key question based on that definition, which is kind of what entity deserves moral standing? So if we're going to take an action and we want it to be considered a moral action, what is it that we should extend moral standing to? What is it that deserves moral standing? I mean, I think most people would say, well, other human beings, although I think certain people believe different things about different groups of human beings, and so they might extend different degrees of moral standing to different groups of human beings. But I think most people in the world have this sense that human beings certainly have moral standing in a general sense. They deserve moral standing because they have intrinsic value. So something with intrinsic value is something that has value in and of itself. Just because it exists, it has value. So a baby is born, and that baby we extend moral standing to simply because it's a human being. By virtue of the fact that it fits into the category of human beings, we extend moral standing to it. And some people would say that same thing of any sentient animal, for instance. They might say, well, that animal, has the capacity to think and feel, and therefore moral standing should be extended to that. So that's an example of where different people might differ in how they choose to extend moral standing. Well, so to say that something doesn't have intrinsic value doesn't mean it doesn't have value. But we make this distinction between something with intrinsic value, which has value simply because it exists and falls into some category that we're concerned about, and something that has instrumental value, which is it has value, but its value has to do with what it can do for us, right? So its value is related to its effects on an entity that does have intrinsic value. So, a cat, for instance, I have a cat, I like my cat. Some people might say, well, the cat's not a human being, it doesn't really have intrinsic value, but it's giving you a great deal of pleasure as a human being, and so it has this instrumental value, or the same could be said of my bicycle. My bicycle, it's got value because it gives me pleasure and does other good things. But it's just an instrument. It's not like it has the bike doesn't have moral value. That's probably a little bit easier one to get at. It only has that instrumental value because it's doing things for me and for the world that one could say is positive from a moral standpoint. But there is this key question when we think about different moral systems, different sort of philosophical worldviews, moralistic worldviews about what are the grounds on which we extend moral standing to other entities? How are we choosing what we extend moral standing to? And that's really kind of one of the hearts of what I want to sort of focus on today, and what I want us to sort of explore today is that question of, how do you, if you allow yourself to exercise methodological belief and occupy these different moral viewpoints for a while, how do you see the goodness or badness of certain actions under different conditions? Because I think it's a very important sort of skill to be able to do, to put yourself into these different moral realms, because the world is full of people who act from very different moral and ethical standpoints. And if we want to get along and make the world more compatible for all of us, we got to understand where people are coming from and understand how we see them. So let's talk about these ethical systems. So when we think about sort of traditional Western ethics, generally what we're talking about is the field of ethical humanism. And the terms are a little bit confusing, so you want to kind of hang on to them. So ethical humanism, traditional Western ethics, basically is relatively simple from an ethical standpoint because it focuses on human beings and human society specifically. So the kind of rationale behind this, which you may or may not agree with, but it's important to understand, is that human beings have sort of a unique rationality, a self-awareness, an ability to consider our future. And it just makes sense to think about us, human beings, as the fundamental moral entity. And so moral standing is basically granted to human beings, and everything else has instrumental value. So it might be quite valuable to us, but its value is instrumental to its impact on human beings. So the sort of focal point, the magnifying glass, is focused on human beings as the moral entity, and we judge the goodness or badness of things based on its impact on human beings. So it's pretty straight up Western traditional ethical system. Some people term this anthropocentric ethics because it's focused on human beings, and plants, animals, non-living, they have instrumental value. So, we think about them in terms of the goods and services they might provide us. Now, I do want to point out that you can certainly come at the world from an ethical humanist perspective and have a very strong ethic towards conserving the natural world, respect for the natural world, appreciation for the natural world, based simply on the fact that the natural world, that we're dependent on the natural world. So this sort of anthropocentric or ethical humanism approach in no way is anti-environmental. There's nothing about this that's anti-environmental. It's simply thinking of the environment as something that supports human society and has value, potentially substantial value. So, a lot of what we've talked about in this class in terms of what might be a good or a bad thing for the environment can be viewed from an ethical humanism perspective, and you could be a very strong environmentalist and operate strictly from the ethical humanism perspective. And I think you see a lot of this framing being used within conservative, evangelical Christian communities that actually want to do something to preserve the environment. And they frame the rest of the world as God's creation, right? So God created the world, created it for human beings, specifically for human beings, but we need to protect God's creation because it supports humanity. So again, there's many ways you could come at this that really are very positive towards the environment. Of course, there's ways that are very negative. You could come at it and say, well, everything else has instrumental value, so let's tear up the mountains and dig up the coal and extract the oil and pollute the skies. As long as we're doing that to help, as long as what we're doing with those things is helping human beings, then it's all good. We should do that stuff. So it's not like it necessarily leads to one way or the other. I'm just saying it's not inconsistent with a strong environmental worldview, even that particular perspective. Okay, let's shift to another perspective. And my sense is that although you may or may not have thought about it, many of you may actually occupy this next ethical system, or at least have, some of us occupy several of these concurrently. But the humane moralism perspective kind of extends that. It extends that to thinking about the focal level being all sentient organisms. And different people draw the line, and I've had lots of conversations with particularly vegetarians about like what they will eat and what they will not eat. And you can really see their moral system very much at play in the lines they're drawing. My brother-in-law, who will eat filter feeding organisms like clams, but will not eat fish because he's drawing an ethical line there between the sort of sentience of the fish versus the filter feeding organisms. And that's important to him. But that's an example of humane moralism where you're extending this moral view beyond individual organisms to other organisms. Now I'll say this, it's still organism focused. It's focused on organisms. So it is very focused on individual organisms and whether that organism has moral standing based on, again, criteria that may be a little bit different, but it's the focal thing is on basically whether an organism can experience suffering is generally the way it's framed. And so pain is kind of pain and suffering are considered the principal evils of the world. And so you look at a thing and you say, can it experience pain? And if it can experience pain, you extend moral standing to it and say, I don't want to cause pain in this world. I'm opposed to pain in the world, and so I want to protect that thing and don't let that thing suffer. And this viewpoint is very often critical of anthropocentric, an ethical humanist perspective. A humane moralist would be very critical of an ethical humanist for not extending that morality to other species, and they often use terms like human chauvinism or speciesism, to sort of be critical of that limitation of extension of moral standing beyond human beings. And again, I think as I've already made clear, this is very often one important underpinning for the animal rights movement and ethics and activism. Very, very often it's focused on the pain and suffering of animals, and so it's very often used in support of that. So I want to think a little bit about how the sort of levels of organizational concept that we talked about before fits into that. Remember, we talked about this idea of reductionism or holism. Reductionism being sort of a worldview based on taking things apart into their individual parts and sort of considering their individual parts in isolation from each other and trying to understand the world in terms of these individual agents. And I think one might critique both ethical humanism and humane moralism for focusing on individual parts, sort of judging a thing based on the individual entity. Does it experience pain or pleasure? Does it fall into categories that deserve moral standing, as opposed to the holistic worldview we talked about, which is more focused on, the interactions between components in the system. And I will say that I think most of the world probably, well, actually, I shouldn't say that, because I think that's most of the Western world probably falls pretty squarely into humane moralism or ethical humanism as ways of seeing things. But we talked about this idea of emergent properties that are only manifest at the whole system level, whole being greater than some of its parts. I want to take a moment now to focus on who you read a little bit of Sand County Almanac for today, and I want to talk a little bit about this fellow. So interesting guy. I find him interesting to my own history because he attended Yale School of Forestry as one of its first classes, and that's where I got my graduate degree. So I have this sort of, I feel a sort of historical connection with him at that level. Very interesting person because he started out very much as an ecologist, as someone who was interested in managing ecosystems. During the original Green Deal, he was very involved in efforts to restore ecosystems that had been degraded, for instance, as a result of the Dust Bowl that we read a little bit about when we considered John Steinbeck's work. So he worked on revegetation, figured out some really important things, so really founded the field of restoration ecology. How do you take degraded systems and restore them? So thinking about our wetland case study, a lot of the sort of initial work on prairie restoration in particular, not wetland restoration, but prairie restoration was pioneered by this guy. Actually invented several fields. Wildlife management really came into existence as sort of one of his early works, wrote an important textbook on wildlife management, restoration ecology. But at this point, at least within the environmental studies field writ large, he's most well known for his contribution to the emergence of a field called environmental ethics. And that really embodied in the Sand County Almanac. So a good example of someone who really reflects the interdisciplinarity that we very much value within the field of environmental studies, thinking across these domains of science and social science and humanities. And I think probably he's best remembered for this concept of the land ethic, which you read about. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background before talking about this as sort of a bit of a counterpoint to the other ethical systems. And an ethical system that is in fact, although we give, Aldo Leopold some credit for defining this within the sort of Western tradition, a worldview, an ethical system that is actually vastly more consistent with the ethical system of many traditional peoples around the world. And when Chia Sakakibara comes in next week, I think you're going to find that what she has to say about the Inupiat people is very closely aligned to what Leopold sort of put forward as a way of thinking about ethics from an ecological perspective. And so I'm putting this forward as a third ethical system, the land ethic, which some people refer to as an ecocentric perspective as opposed to an anthrocentric perspective. It's very different from the other two in that the focal level is not individual organisms, it's the interaction. It's actually focusing on the interactions. It's not focusing on the individual components. It's focusing on the individual component based on how it's interacting with other elements in the system. It's looking at the emergent properties of the system and assessing the value of the individual component on how it's contributing to that larger collective ensemble of properties that are known as sort of emergent properties. So the focal level is at the larger level. It's sort of a scale issue, the entire biotic community. And so here, again, very different in that the moral standing of the individual part is based on its contribution to the integrity of the entire biotic community. So very, very different, different perspective. And again, some people call it ecocentric ethical perspective. And it's looking at that part in terms of its contribution to the whole. And here's just a little quote: "The thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends otherwise." So that's kind of like the most fundamental statement of the land ethic. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the entire community. It's wrong when it tends otherwise. And while he was focused, coming at this from a very ecological perspective, from our perspective, thinking about this issue of sustainability, incorporating social, economic, and ecological dimensions, I think we could apply that same thing in more fully considering issues of justice, issues of economic viability of something, to sort of judge the goodness or badness of something. How does it fit within that entire systems level context of things? So again, focal point is the ecosystem. Moral standing of individual part is based on contribution to the whole, consideration of scales. And like I say, we sort of give credit to Aldo Leopold for having defined this concept in the tradition of our Western culture. But in fact, what he's saying is entirely consistent with hundreds of thousands of years of cultural development of many native peoples around the world. And so I have this quote here from Oren Lyons, who is chief of the Onondaga Nation. "We're looking ahead, as is one of the first mandates given us as chiefs, to make sure and to make every decision that we make relate to the welfare and well-being of the seventh generation to come. What about the seventh generation? Where are you taking them? What will they have?" So again, this sort of explicit consideration of how does this thing in this place affect other things in other places? How does this thing at this time affect other things at later times? And I'm sure many of you have heard the sort of the seventh generation concept, thinking about seven generations down. Very, very alien to our culture right now, at least our economic system right now, which thinks in very, very short time scales. Certainly not that kind of time scale. So anyway, again, in fact, not much of what Aldo Leopold had to say on this front was actually new, but he was reframing it in this context of Western culture. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about similarities and differences between these ethical systems. So on one hand, if we think about extending moral standing beyond human beings, both the humane moralist viewpoint and the land ethicist, they're both extending moral standing beyond simply human beings. But the focal point on the sort of individual organism is characteristic of both the ethical humanist perspective and the humane moralist perspective when we're thinking about things. So there's similarities and differences in these as moral worldviews. Okay, cool. I want to do some little mini case studies in which we think a little bit about a couple scenarios. And so let me give you the first scenario, because I think these do a good job of sort of helping us to think about how people from these different moral standpoints might view a given situation. So here's our first scenario. So I want you to be thinking about how an ethical humanist, a humane moralist, and a land ethicist might think about these different problems. Okay, so I'll read this and you can read it together with me. As a combined result of human removal of natural predators and increased habitat, also human-induced, there are more white-tailed deer in the continental US than there were when European settlers first arrived. This results in a number of problems for humans and for the environment. For instance, deer overpopulation results in excessive browsing that severely damages forest ecosystems. Deer also consume agricultural crops and can cause substantial economic losses for farmers. Finally, deer are a major hazard on the road and result in thousands of highway fatalities each year. Hunting, birth control, and introduction of predators are some of the options considered and employed as control measures. So that's a scenario. And what I want you to do is think for a moment how these three different ethical viewpoints might look at this problem and might consider potential solutions to the problem. Think about that for a moment. And then I want you to chat with your group members who hopefully you can interact with for a minute on this. And I don't want to give you very long. So yeah, you've got about 5 minutes to do this. And then we'll share thoughts on this. right, another minute. All right, I'm sure you guys are having good discussions, but I'm going to cut you off. And I think what I'll do is I'll just call on some different people. Okay, so I just want to get out there how people might think about this, how these different perspectives might be brought to bear on this. And I'm going to call on people. If you feel put out by that, just say pass, and I'll call on someone else. But Kobe, what do you think? What would an ethical humanist have to say about this situation? They wouldn't worry so much about that, you're saying. Right. Right. They just want to get the job done because they're focused on human beings. So in some ways, maybe they'd probably ask the question, which one of these is going to be most effective, most cost effective, and reduce them at the greatest level? Because we're worried about the corn, we're worried about people being highway fatalities. Like those are the ethical concerns there. Everyone good on that? Okay, so let's shift to the humane moralist. Nee, what do you think about the humane moralist? How would the humane moralist look at this situation? You can pass if you want, it's fine. If, you want to pass? Okay, yes. Sadie, I'm sorry. Well, what would the humane moralist see as sort of the problem? How would they frame the problem? Like, what are they worried about in this situation? Because why? What are they worried about when they think about the world? What are they concerned about? So Sadie's saying that the deer are an ethical concern themselves, and the issue of the issues we need to consider are going to need to be considered from the perspective of the deer having moral standing, and that in fact their overpopulation may be a result of us, and that when we think about the situation, we need to consider the deer. So Sadie, I think you suggested birth control as a potential thing, as something that might not interfere that might address the problem, but might not interfere so much with the deer's pain or pleasure. Other thoughts on that? I'll open things up. Yeah. Yeah, so that's an interesting thought that maybe, well, there's also an extension there, which is if they're thinking about the predators, maybe they're thinking about the pain and suffering of the pleasure of the predators and them and what they might gain from being able to eat them. Although I think there's a bit of a conundrum there because obviously that is causing some pain and suffering to the deer as well. Yeah.
Deer dying by like a human, hunting them, or just like a wolf, and that's like how nature works. Yeah.
Right, right. You know, and I don't claim to be an expert in humane moralism, and my guess is that there are humane moralists who would actually fall on different sides of like what would be most effective here. But I think my guess is that Sadie's thought about birth control, if they felt like the deer needed to, that the issue of overpopulation needed to be addressed because it was actually impinging on the deer's pleasure. I mean, if there's overabundance, they're actually starving and not experiencing pleasure, that might be one which would minimize pain and therefore be one that would be worthy of consideration. All right, let's think about this from sort of the land ethicist perspective. Anyone want to give that one a shot? Yeah, no. Right. Yeah, Madison. Yeah, Emma.
I think definitely like I would also like I think necessarily like from a land ethics perspective, it's almost like considering it both in that like maybe like it would be more like definitely the introduction of natural predators because humans have removed that, and that is one of the things that caused the imbalance in the ecosystem in the first place, like sort of ice through the introduction of gold and Yellowstone and stuff.
Right.
But I think like also like if we're talking about the ecosystem as a whole, you could also be for hunting and birth control and introduction of predators all as like a combined effort to just reintroduce the ecosystem into a sort of natural balance and then let it like try and find a way that it could be in more of a stable, like more resilient system so that like
retaining its self-organizing properties, et cetera.
Yeah.
Right, so you're suggesting two possible feedback introductions. One is predators, and that has been very popular among a lot of ecologists in sort of like you know, addressing various ecological problems in parks that occur when you nuke all the predators. You get this overabundance of prey. Addressing that issue. One interesting thing I'm seeing is almost a little bit of tension here in comments about the land ethicist is a focus on the ecosystem, you know, the plants, the animals, as opposed to the ecosystem and the human system around it. And, you know, I think that probably is some tension within, I think, you know, when Aldo Leopold put this forward, it was at a time when I think he was thinking more about the non-human elements of the ecosystem than the full human scope of the ecosystem. But if you broaden that out to think about, like, you know, the full human scope, like, we do need to produce food for ourselves. It is a problem that agricultural productivity is being interfered with by these deer. That's like part of the larger scope of, you know, thinking about social and economic dimensions of sustainability. So if you're expanding it to that scale, you might be proposing different solutions than if you're thinking about it more strictly from the natural, you know, how do you maintain relationships in the natural ecosystem? So that's like an important thing to think about. Like, what scale are you considering? What all are you incorporating as fundamental to the system that you want to sort of think about? What is the system, you know, that you're trying to bring back into some sort of you know, balance there? When you think about how each part contributes to the whole, what's the whole that you're considering there, which is, I think, an important philosophical piece to add into this. But great thinking going on here. Any other just sort of general comments on this scenario and thinking about this? All right, great. I want to talk a little bit now about environmental justice, which is kind of another dimension. So we've talked about these moral perspectives, thinking about morality. And I think one of the most, you know, sort of powerful and I think positive developments within environmental studies over the last couple decades has been really, I think, with the emergence of sustainability as a central focus, is really beginning to place a high degree of value on the social justice dimensions. And as I've said before, it's one of the things that makes me hopeful about the current political movements like the Green New Deal, in the extent to which they're prioritizing or understanding, it's not just prioritizing, it's understanding that you cannot solve ecological problems, environmental problems, without solving issues of social justice, that the solutions have to address both, because if you address one and not the other, you're fundamentally it's not gonna be sustainable. It's gonna fail if you're not addressing that. So I want to talk about just a couple basic background points on environmental justice. Oh, extra points to anyone who can recognize the two individuals at the bottom of the screen here. Yeah. Yeah, that's Cesar Chavez, who we think of as being a major figure in the labor rights movement among immigrant farmers. What people forget, and I think oftentimes people want to look at the environmental movement as the sort of history of the conservation movement, but there's a very long history of activism related to the environment that comes at it from a labor or a human rights perspective. And I think Cesar Chavez is a great example of that, organizing migrant farm workers, among other things, against the sort of like environmental practices, the use of pesticides, the unsafe working conditions, the ecologically damaging working conditions. Anyone know the person on the right? That is Robert Boulard. He's one of the sort of grandfathers, I guess you would say, of the environmental justice movement. Okay, so the analysis here. Different groups have different degrees of power. Practices and policies result in differences in the environmental benefits and burdens to different groups of people. So the issue of environmental justice is very much focused on issues of disproportionate benefits and burdens. Who is benefiting from, positive environmental things? Who's being hurt by negative environmental things? And the other piece of that has to do with who is making decisions. So this issue of power, this issue of benefits, this issue of burdens. These are all at the center of issues of environmental justice. And there are two types of equity that are important to distinguish and understand here. One has to do with this concept of distributive justice. And distributive justice relates to how the benefits, so when I say benefits, I mean things like parks, clean air, clean water. Who's receiving most of the environmental good stuff? That's benefits. How are those distributed? Also, the burdens. Who is receiving the dirty water, the dirty air, and lack of, ability to experience, quality environmental conditions. So that has to do with how goods and bads are distributed across society. So that's one issue of equity. The other has to do with who is participating in the decision making. So generally, when we think about environmental justice, we're thinking about both of these things. Who's experiencing the benefits and the burdens, and who is making the decisions that create the benefits and the burdens. And that is sometimes referred to as participatory justice and sometimes referred to as procedural justice, because it's about the procedure by which decisions are made, right? So when you think about environmental justice, you need to think about both dimensions of that. Who's making the decisions, who's experiencing the consequences of those decisions. So let's talk a little bit about distributive justice, because there are many ways in which environmental goods and bads are distributed to people among different groups we can identify in society. Low-income people, affluent people, people of different races, people of various different categories, people of different regions, people who live in different places, and also importantly, this issue of across generations. The seventh generation concept plays in here. How are goods and bads being distributed to people now as opposed to people in the future? And obviously, the issues surrounding climate change are all about distributive justice in an intergenerational sense, as well as in a geographical sense. Where are people living and who's going to experience the fires, the floods, the negative impacts of climate change? So yeah, we consider among different groups of people, we consider among different regions of the country. That's a map of poverty in the United States there. And generally speaking, the environmental bads, that is pollution emitted by factories, is principally occurring in low-income regions. That's where you put damaging stuff in. Way back when Oberlin was considering, the city of Oberlin was considering its energy future, it thought about whether we wanted to go green or whether we wanted to build a large new coal-fired power plant. Had we built a large new coal-fired power plant, it would have been in Meigs County, Ohio, which is a county that already has several coal-fired power plants in it, in which the people in that county experience all of the negative impacts of having that coal in their communities, low-income community. And so we would have essentially been engaging in an environmental injustice where we'd be pushing the negative impacts onto another community. We decided not to do that. But obviously this intergenerational issue is one that's very central to issues of climate change and climate justice. What we're doing now is going to have a disproportionately negative impact on future generations. So on the participatory justice side, what we're talking about is who is involved in making the decisions about the future. And the reality is that the benefits and burdens are very unequally distributed in time and space, and groups do not participate equally in decision making. That little map up there on the right is known as Cancer Alley. It's sort of an area that has a disproportionate number of mostly plastic factories, PVC manufacturing, which has a lot of cancer rates. It's a low-income community. It's a principally African-American community. So it is a quintessential example of how the benefits and the burdens in this case are not equally distributed in time. I want to escape from this for 1 minute and leave you with just a video that hopefully I have queued up here to play on environmental injustice. This is it comes from the Atlantic magazine. Let me just flip back here and make sure my speaker's set up right on this. Give me 1 second. It's just a 1-minute video. Let's see if it'll play through my speakers. Oh, good. Hold on, let me just cue this up with a little bit more volume. Can you guys hear that okay? Okay.
One of the most basic pieces of human life, and every reason the water we drink are controlled and designed by people. And people, more than half, all people who live close to hazardous waste are people of color. Footprint nationwide, top of black and Hispanic. Black children are twice as likely to suffer less than white children. This inequality is no accident. Community and the risk of disaster are astounding. Black and brown communities through generations of discrimination and political strife. Enslaved African people were commodities partly because they worked in an environment with that were reflected in white. And Jim Crow laws created racial segregation. They also reinforced the environmental system that still discriminates. It's no wonder that Black and Hispanic children have the highest rate of accident will occur because they work in which white people in the world, not very much. The Jim Crow laws are dead wrong, but the fact that people of color are still likely to die in environmental causes, no action.
All right, just want to leave you with that, and I know we got to go now. And remember that next week we are meeting in the evening and online.